At Carafem, you can choose the abortion care that works best for you. With in-person visits in Atlanta, Chicago, and the D.C. area, or medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. Some people feel more comfortable meeting with a provider in person and leaving either no longer pregnant or with pills in hand. Others prefer getting abortion pills by mail. Just fill out a short online form and, if eligible, your medication arrives in a few days in a plain package. When you choose abortion pills, Cara, our text-based abortion companion, is with you every step of the way, offering 24/7 support and answers whenever you need them. However you get care, Carafem will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carafem.org.
In Walmart's Who Newville, joy started to grow. For online-only savings sure to steal the show. Tech treats and toys so dazzling and new. Walmart Cyber Monday deal soon ready for you. It's online only with very little time to spare. December 1st will soon be here, so be sure to be there. The Who's are prepared. Are you ready too? A day packed with savings. Amazing! Who knew? Subject to availability, terms and fees apply.
If you were a murder detective, one of the things you want to establish is when was the victim last seen alive. And the Ninth Legion was last seen alive in the north of England. 108 AD, last recorded mention. So the Ninth Legion had been based in York, and there's evidence that it was moved to Carlisle at some point just before Emperor Hadrian came to power. And after that, it disappeared from all historical recordings. However, there's been some tantalizing evidence that's been uncovered in recent years, but at various sites around southwest Scotland, within a perimeter of between 50 and 70 kilometres north of Carlisle, a number of copper military pots have been found. So these are cooking pots which were carried by legionaries, and they're pretty valuable. They weren't cheap. They cost quite a bit of money. So for these things just to be lost seems, unlikely. So could it be that these pots were stripped from the dead bodies of Roman legionaries and carried off to various Iron Age villages around the southwest of Scotland?
Hello. In around 108 AD, the Legio IX Hispania, or the Ninth Legion, a unit of just over 5,000 men, was last recorded at York in Britannia, possibly heading north towards Caledonia, modern-day Scotland. What happened next, no one knows for sure, and the Ninth disappeared from historical record. The loss would have been a stunning humiliation for Rome, but what would be the response of Hadrian, the emperor who took power a few years later in 117 AD? Within a few years, a new wall dividing Britannia from the wild Novanti and Selgovi tribes would be constructed, a wall that still stands today and is named after the emperor under which it was built. Joining the pod today is author Alistair Tosh as we discuss Hadrian's Wall in this bonus episode. Coming up on Saturday, Sarah Griswold and Miranda Malins join to discuss women and history, herstory if you will, so please do join for that. But until then, it's Alistair Tosh and me talking Hadrian's Wall. Alistair, welcome to the podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure to be here, Ollie.
Well, this is fantastic because we're going to talk about, so listeners, this is a subject I actually don't have as much Roman history on as I probably should. I think the last person I had on discussing Roman history was Tom Holland. It might have been Fiona Forsyth.
Oh, Fiona Forsyth, yeah.
Yes, she was talking about Ovid.
Yes.
But before that was Tom Holland doing the history. So you've got big shoes to fill there, Alistair. No pressure.
I've got very big shoes to fill.
Alistair is the author of the Edge of Empire trilogy. And the first of which is called Siege. Then it's Hunt and then Warrior.
Correct.
So, but what we're talking about today is the subject of certainly Siege. Correct me if I'm wrong, because you move around Europe, don't you?
Yeah, I do. So the first two books are firmly anchored in basically the southwest of Scotland and Roman Britain. And then it moves on to Roman Spain in the third book, following the character Lucius Fenius Felix, who was a real character, existed. He was a tribune who was based in Birrens Fort in the southwest of Scotland near Ecclefechan. Although he existed, the character that I've written is completely fictional.
Right.
But it's anchored in real history.
So listeners may have detected an accent
Yes.
on Alistair's behalf. So that betrays that you are indeed Scottish.
Correct.
And so that is probably why you're interested in, and so this is Hadrian's Wall we're going to be talking about, both when there was a wall there and when there wasn't. But presumably that is why you are interested in this period of history, because it really does early Scottish history, really.
It really is. I was born in Dumfries, which is the southwest of Scotland. So you're basically sort of 30 miles north of Carlisle. You know, just over the Solway Firth. And Dumfriesshire and Cumbria is absolutely riddled with Roman and Iron Age history. Not to mention, along with Viking and Saxon history as well. But there's a lot going on archaeologically in Dumfriesshire, and that's what really drew me into the Roman world as a young man. Really, I mean, Hadrian's Wall is endlessly fascinating. The 300-year-long period of existence, but for me, the most fascinating element of it is, why was it built in the first place?
Yes, that is the most interesting part, because what I'd like to ask you first really is, because, okay, so for the listeners' benefit, Hadrian's Wall is built around 122 AD, obviously during the reign of Hadrian. But does that mean, so we had the invasion of Britain under the Emperor Claudius?
Correct. Yeah, so this is a long time. This is 80 years after that, when Hadrian's Wall was built.
So does that mean the Roman army how far did they get before the wall was built? And were they dealing with, and it's the Picts we're really talking about, isn't it?
The Picts came later.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for picking me up
Yeah.
there. So tell us about, let's talk, what was Scotland like before the Romans arrived?
It was an Iron Age society split into dozens of different tribal units. I mean, probably not a heck of a lot different from the sort of Jacobean times, really. We had got lots of Scottish clans all over the place, all warring with each other, and it's been a fairly violent place for centuries, and it's only really in the last probably 300-400 years where things have really settled down. Particularly talking about the Highlands here, and obviously what you can bear in mind is, as a historical fiction writer, I feel less constrained with what I might want to say historically, where a historian might feel he has to be a bit more careful with his wording.
Indeed. And so these tribes that you talk about were, as we get further south to what we'll use the modern day border of between Scotland and England today, which is roughly between Carlisle and Berwick on Tweed. As you get closer to that border, which didn't exist then, of course, do you get less, I'm trying to think of the best way to word it, less wild tribes? Well, because they're more interacting with other Celtic tribes that are also.
Yeah, it was much like in the south. When after Caesar initially invaded in 40 BC, roughly around that time. After that point, a lot of the southern tribes of Britannia became, if not Romanized, certainly very friendly with Rome. And then by the time Rome has advanced through what we now think of as modern England, Rome has essentially established a border, if you like, which basically straddles the modern line of Hadrian's Wall. It was called the Stane Gate. So that there was a series of fortresses along what would become Hadrian's Wall, which demarked a militarized zone. And some of the tribes above that were more friendly to Rome than the ones further north.
What was the interaction with the Romans then up until the reign of Hadrian?
It varied. So some of the tribes on the eastern coast of southeast Scotland were more friendly towards the Romans, but you had the likes of the Novanti and what is now Galloway, were very anti the Romans. There was continual warring at that side of modern-day Scotland. And it's possibly that sort of warfare that ultimately led to the wall being built. And it's hard to, for my mind, to separate the conflict that led up, likely conflict that led up to the building of Hadrian's Wall with the enigmatic Ninth Legion, which is made famous by Rosemary Sutcliffe in her Eagle of the Ninth book. There's a number of historians have said that the Ninth Legion surely couldn't have been destroyed in northern Scotland. The northern Scottish tribes couldn't have destroyed the Legion, so it must have been moved eastward and destroyed in one of the Jewish wars. But there's no evidence of that. All the evidence, firm evidence, is that something happened to the Ninth Legion in the north of Britain.
When you say the north of Britain, how far north are we talking?
If you were a murder detective,
yeah,
one of the things you want to establish is when was the victim last seen alive? And the Ninth Legion was last seen alive in the north of England. 108 AD was its last recorded mention. So the Ninth Legion had been based in York, and there's military tile evidence that it was moved to Carlisle at some point just before Emperor Hadrian's came to power. And after that, it disappeared from all historical recordings. However, there's been some tantalizing evidence that's been uncovered in recent years. So nothing that mentions the Ninth Legion, but at various sites around southwest Scotland, within a perimeter of between 50 and 70 kilometres north of Carlisle, a number of copper military pots have been found. So these are cooking pots which were carried by legionaries, and they're pretty valuable. They weren't cheap. They cost quite a bit of money. So for these things just to be lost seems, unlikely. So could it be that these pots were stripped from the dead bodies of Roman legionaries and carried off to various Iron Age villages around the southwest of Scotland? I've heard that mentioned by the likes of Dr. John Reed. It's a theory, but it just seems a pretty good theory. The Ninth Legion disappears, and then we're finding all this evidence of Roman pots, copper pots found all over the place in the southwest of Scotland.
Are those finds, when you say southwest of Scotland, are we talking, Stranraer or?
No, it's sort of more, it seems to be if you're sort of heading northeastward line, almost like if you're going from Carlisle to Edinburgh, there's a band. If you start 50 kilometres out from north of Carlisle, and it seems to end about 70 kilometres north at various Iron Age sites.
Okay, so it's not as though the Ninth got so far up into the Highlands or anything like that.
Well, this is just theorising, but it just seems the most plausible thing. The Ninth disappears from the historical record at some point in the early 2nd century. And then Hadrian comes along and builds his wall. It just seems the two seem to be, in my mind, as a historical fiction writer and somebody who reads a lot of historical books, it just seems the most likely thing to have happened.
It's tantalizing, really, because presumably, what is the reason for them to be sent that far north? Is it an order to the sort of centurion pacify the region, and then it's effectively Rome?
Well, it's unknown, but there's a number of tantalizing pieces of evidence. I was just refreshing my memory the other day. There's a number of victory coins were struck in AD 119, which record a victory in Britannia. Where it was, no one really knows, but it must have been in the north. And then there's in the Augustan histories, it mentioned Emperor Hadrian's time that the Britons could not be held under Roman control. There's a single half a sentence. And there's another one years later, Cornelius Fronto, who was a confidant of Marcus Aurelius, writes a letter to the emperor saying, mentions in the reign of your grandfather Hadrian, what great numbers of soldiers were slain by the Jews and what great numbers were slain by the Britons. There's a lot of, I wouldn't call it circumstantial, but certainly there's certainly a body of evidence that points towards something happening in the early part of Hadrian's reign or just before. It seems like the tribes are making a nuisance of themselves in what is now southern Scotland.
The Romans then, they've lost the ninth, and it clearly is going to be resource heavy to deal with these Scottish tribes. The wall is to be built.
Yeah, so Emperor Hadrian, he does his tour of the empire. I mean, it's not just in Britannia that they're building significant border limitations. And along the Rhine and the Danube, they're building fortresses and defences. Obviously, in Germania, you've got the Rhine and you've got the Danube, so that's significant barriers in their own right. But in Britain, they didn't have that. So instead, they build a wall, and it's a massive structure for the day. It's the biggest stone-built structure ever built in the Roman Empire. They build hundreds of turrets, dozens of mile castles, there's 16 fortresses. And obviously, we don't know for certain, but based on the size of its base, it was probably 3.5 to 4.5 meters high. It probably had
Right. So I'm just going to stop you there, because that is what's really interesting to me, is the size. Because, of course, as a schoolboy, you read of Hadrian's Wall and you immediately compare it to the Great Wall of China. And I think when you look at the remains, you're like, oh. But as you say, 3.5 to 4 meters high that's a serious wall.
It really is.
This is the largest stone structure in the Roman Empire.
The largest stone structure ever built, for the whole period of the Roman Empire, including all the way through to the Eastern Empire to its eventual end in the 16th century. It's absolutely massive.
And that rather leads one to think that maybe, that's a powerful reason to build such a wall, is because they've lost a legion like the ninth.
Well, I mean, it's hard to ignore. And it's a massive structure. And there's been theories that, it was just a vanity project of Hadrian's. It's enormous and it cost an absolute arm and a leg to build. 3 legions were involved in building it. I've heard it mentioned that it might be it's a customs thing, to stop the trade going north and coming south. The Romans want to tax it, but there's no evidence of significant trade into the north.
That seems rather a counterproductive way to make money, is to build a structure that's so expensive.
Well, exactly, but also don't forget the Stane Gate was already there, so you still had a series of forts along the same line that could have fulfilled the same function if it was just a customs thing. And also it could be something like a Trumpian wall, to stop the tribes migrating south. But once again, surely a bunch of forts with Roman soldiers in there could stop that. All of those seem so improbable. To build such a significant structure at such a significant cost by so many soldiers. And not only that, I think one of the significant things is the first few years of the western side of the wall were built in turf. So turf and with a wooden palisade. And one of the theories is that the Emperor Hadrian ordered that the wall be finished as quickly as possible because the trouble was still going on. So instead of finishing it in the brick, they built it in turf and eventually replaced it over the next sort of 10 years in stone. They just wanted to get it up quickly because they needed to defend themselves.
Right. And how much involvement did Hadrian have in the wall? I mean, it's taken his name, of course, but was this something? I mean, it's such a large structure, as you've mentioned. That implies that he would have kept an eye on progress.
Yeah, it's difficult to know. There's no real written evidence of him being involved. I mean, he visited, and I'm sure as any emperor, he would have given his view, but what he actually said, who knows? And
when do we first see the term Hadrian's Wall?
At that time, I don't think it was ever called Hadrian's Wall. I think I'm right in saying there was some pots that were probably souvenirs from Hadrian's Wall that showed a crenulated Hadrian's Wall.
And so, right, the wall is up 120. I get it takes many years to be built, so it begins in 122 AD.
It was pretty quick. It was built pretty quick. I think it was built over 2 or 3 years. It didn't take very long.
Ah, right,
We
okay.
really got stuck in about it.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Okay, so wall is erected. That means that these Scottish tribes now are going to have trouble getting across it. But what happens in the 20-year period? Because 20 years later, we have a further wall built further north, the Antonine Wall in 142. Although I think that's not made of stone. That's made of...
No. That was in some ways similar to the original western end of Hadrian's Wall. I think this probably was a bit of a vanity project. So Emperor Hadrian dies, and his ordains as his successor is Antoninus Pius. And Antoninus Pius was an administrator. He'd never been a soldier. He'd been a senator in charge of one province, but it was a peaceful one. It wasn't one that needed. There was no legions there, for example. So he was an administrator. So he had to prove his martial credentials. So he, instead of leading an army himself, he sent one Quintus Lollius Urbicus, who was a soldier. He'd fought in the Bar Kokhba war in Palestine. He was a pretty experienced soldier. He came to northern Britain and, under the auspices of Antoninus Pius, invaded what is modern-day Scotland once more. Unclear how far north he got, whether the original intention was to conquer the whole of modern-day Scotland. After, I think, more or less 3 years of war, they settled on ending the empire at the Clyde Forth Isthmus and built a wall of turf. But it was a significant barrier. They had dozens of forts, massive ditch to the fore, lots of anti-personnel traps. But significantly, even after 20 years, there was never any civilian settlements. There was never any villas built south of the wall. It was only ever a military installation. And it must have been hellish up there because, apart from small civilian settlements around individual forts, no civilians went north. It was just too dangerous, clearly.
Fascinating. So that means, does that therefore mean, and so just for the listeners' benefit, that's roughly between, is it modern day Glasgow and Falkirk or Edinburgh?
No, so not that far north. So it's from Old Kilpatrick, right at the mouth of the Clyde, all the way through to Caradon, which is on the Firth of Forth. It's still a significant monument in its own right. If you ever visit some of the sites there, in places the ditch is, you can go down to the ditch and it's still way above you. It's 3 or 4 meters above your head. It was a massive installation, but really, after 19, 20 years, the Romans withdrew because it was a complete waste of time being up there.
So they weren't then spending their time of pacifying this zone that is created with, this band created by the two walls.
Certainly, there were wall forts north of Hadrian's Wall. So during that period, they built Hadrian's Wall, and then they built a number of fortresses north of the wall. So like Burns near Ecclefechan in the southwest of Scotland, which was built to house a Millaria Equitata, which is a double-strength cohort, a specialist cohort that had cavalry in there as well, had a cavalry wing. And they were only ever put in place for specialist roles like subjugating a local area. And given that Burns is basically in a place where we think 3 tribes met, so the Navanti, the Selgovae, and Brigantes, well, the elements of the Brigantes, whose land had been split by Hadrian's Wall. So that fortress stayed in place even when the Antonine Wall had been built. So clearly there was still trouble going on between the two walls. Clearly Hadrian's Wall wouldn't have had the same number of troops on it, but whether it was completely abandoned during that period, I think it's doubtful. Because why would they have built the Vallum south of Hadrian's Wall if they didn't expect trouble from the Brigantes in the south? And so whether the Brigantes had been pacified fully by then is probably doubtful after only a few years. There was a lot going on, it seems.
So there are clashes between the Romans and various tribes for the remainder of the occupation by the Romans, isn't there?
So if you look over the 300 years, the only period where we seem to have a gap is after the Septimus Severus's invasion of Scotland in the early 3rd century, which was the last major invasion of Romans into Scotland. But it seems like it was a really punitive invasion. They went north with 40,000 troops, and they seem to have the view by some is that they committed a form of genocide up in Scotland, so that there's no mention of anywhere of any problems for the next 100 years. Now, whether that's because we just don't have the written record and there's nothing archaeologically has been discovered, but certainly things seem to have been quiet for the next 100 years after the Severan invasion.
This is the trouble, is that the paucity of sources for certainly, on the tribal side. We've still got another couple of 100 years until the Romans leave then, from Septimus Severus. And so do we know much about that period around the Hadrian's Wall and further north?
We know that Hadrian's Wall was manned right to the very end of the Roman occupation Britannia, right to the very end. The troops on Hadrian's Wall were not legionaries; they were auxiliary troops. So at the beginning of its life, these troops came from all over the empire, particularly the sort of Germanic tribes, on the Tungrians and the Nervi. A lot of troops from Spain, from Croatia, from Hungary, modern-day Hungary, Austria. There's records of Syrians being there. So it was a real mixed bag of peoples that that manned Hadrian's Wall. I find that endlessly fascinating. I mean, some of these troops had fairly savage ways of doing things. I mean, there's evidence of headhunting. There's a military gravestone that's been found in Lancaster. There was a significant fortress in Lancaster that shows a Roman cavalryman, auxiliaryman, carrying the severed head of an enemy. So you can almost imagine some of these forts along Hadrian's Wall with their barrack blocks with enemy heads hanging outside of them. That's just my imagination running wild. But it's I just think they're, for me, more fascinating than the sort of legionaries who were probably better trained, better paid, and we all know from various films on TV. But I think the auxiliaries are much more fascinating.
We're on the northwest farthest reaches of the Roman Empire is the limit. And so, I think the auxiliaries, I guess, interacting with tribes and fighting probably frequent clashes, even, down to small numbers. As you say, they're there till to the very end of the Roman presence in Britain. That clearly means that the auxiliaries are stationed there or placed there. I mean, there's a real military need for them to be there.
Yeah, I mean, there really is. And even when, end of the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, are basically the Romans are at war with themselves. The emperor gets killed and there's a war between 3 or 4 other guys who want to be made emperor. And this carries on for decades. So the empire becomes close to being bankrupt. And troops are withdrawn from Britain to fight, for these would-be emperors. But never do they abandon the wall, Hadrian's Wall. There's always troops in Hadrian's Wall. And this may in part be to the fact that although the troops were auxiliary and they originally came from different parts of the Roman Empire, over time, it seems fairly clear that these became family businesses. Sons would follow fathers and grandfathers into the family business, into the cohort. They were local people. So there was self-interest there. So obviously they're getting paid to guard the wall, but obviously they can feed their families as well. So then when you come to the end of the empire, in the last few years, they're still guarding the wall because it's in their interest to guard the wall. And then when the empire comes to an end, there's evidence that the former commanders of these cohorts become, I guess tribal leader might be too strong a word, but certainly they're warlords. They become warlords, and their auxiliary troops are their warriors. And I think there's quite a long period where that's still the case.
It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
All right. So if you're a Spanish soldier and you get the glamour posting of Hadrian's Wall, you're not going to want to return from whence you came. You would remain where you were posted.
Yeah. So there's evidence. So I think that, like the Tungrians in particular, some of their cohorts, their regiments, continued to recruit from where they came from. So Belgica, modern day Belgium. But even though, like the first Hispana, for example, which originated from northern Spain, over time, it looks like they almost certainly stopped recruiting from northern Spain because it's a long way to go. And they just recruited locally, but they kept their name. So even like Chester's, for example, Chester's Roman fort on the wall, very similar to the Spanish tribal name, but there's no evidence that they kept recruiting from that tribe because 200-300 years had passed since they.
Yeah, it's an inefficient way of doing it. Yeah. Okay, so fascinating. Right, what becomes of the wall then? Presumably it's not maintained and it gradually crumbles.
But that's essentially it. The wall is abandoned after a period of time. As I said, there'll be local warlords for a period, but then it's difficult to maintain, roofs and bathhouses and granaries and all that. So eventually it gets abandoned. But I mean, as you know, if you visit Hadrian's Wall, it's a fraction of the size it used to be. So clearly, there's been a lot of stone robbing. There's evidence all around Cumbria and Northumberland of churches, abbeys being built from the brick from Hadrian's Wall. You see it in farmhouses. You see it all over. You're just driving down the road along, I think it was the A66, is it? Along that road, you'll see all sorts of buildings with very uniform brickwork, and not stonework, carved stones. So a lot of it was robbed out for use, and particularly in churches and castles around the area.
That's very disappointing behaviour.
It really is. Why couldn't you just leave it as it was?
So do you think the legacy of Hadrian's Wall today is? Because, I mean, this is something that it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so it's got the sticker. But this is something that, okay, it may be not as big, as large as, you can't see it from space like you can the Great Wall of China, but everyone's heard of it, just like they have with the Wall of China.
Well, it's just a fascinating historical monument, really worth visiting, because I mean, almost all of the major fortresses along the wall have their own museums. Probably the preeminent one is Vindolanda. They have a fantastic, there's archaeology work that's been going on there for 50 odd years. and the museum is fantastic. But even so, Hadrian's Wall ended at Bo'ness on Solway, but the sort of military defences continued on the way down the western coast of Cumbria. So there's a number of fortresses and towers, watchtowers all the way along the coast. And one of them is Maryport on the Cumbria coast, and they've got the largest collection of Roman altar stones in Britain. It takes half an hour to walk around, but my goodness, is it fascinating.
It's at Sen House, isn't it?
Sen House, yeah. Sen House Museum is well run, well worth a visit. And that's just one of the smaller museums. If you go to Tully House in Carlisle, they've got a fantastic museum there. And now they have the Hadrian's Wall Path, where you can walk from one end of the wall in the west to the east. I know plenty of people who have done it, for charity and whatnot, but you can even just walk bits of it. It's a great resource. I mean, the people that run it have done a fantastic job.
There's a trail run as well, I think, that goes along it.
Yeah, that's not for me.
I love the Roman. I mean, I was in Deal the other day, which is the site of Julius Caesar's landing.
Yes.
And Roman Britain is this sort of fascinating period of all of our history here on this island. But do you find your books do better? The ones set around Hadrian's Wall, have they done better? Do you think Hadrian's Wall has that draw that makes people buy the books?
Possibly. My books are not titled to show that they're around Hadrian's Wall, and if anything, my books really focus on the individual. They focus on an auxiliary cohort, the First Nirvana, and it's about their work in the wilds of southwest of Scotland. I mean, one of the things that people, and I guess Hollywood's at fault for this, when they see Hadrian's Wall in the movies, it's like, you see a legionary standing on the wall. And that's not really obviously you had that. You had the auxiliaries standing on the wall, but it was the cavalry that had the biggest impact in defending the wall. There was a number of forts that were almost exclusively just cavalry, like Chester's was one, for example, where the cavalry units roamed across the countryside. So not just acting as, scouts or whatever, but actually, if you can imagine the guards in London, you see that, or imagine the military police outside a football stadium just for the match starts. It's really impressive, isn't it? So you can imagine what these Roman cavalrymen must have looked like to an Iron Age society. It must have scared them to bits. So I think the use of cavalry in Hadrian's Wall is definitely under talked about. I think they're very impressive. So unfortunately, towards the end of its life, because cavalry cost something like 5 times more than an infantryman, and the empire was effectively bankrupt, I think the use of cavalry became much less used, and the defences became much more stationary. They had basically had infantry troops who just hardly ever left their fortresses by the looks of it. But even so, they stayed to the end.
And you've mentioned locals who've acquired the stones and the bricks. I mean, most recently we saw that tragic story of the tree being felled, the sycamore tree being felled.
Yeah. That was. It's one of those ones that feels a bit like felt like a bit of a body blow. That one, I think, it's just the most nonsensical thing I think I've ever seen.
A sign of the times, Alistair. I think as a novelist as well, though, I suppose the wall is most present, I suppose, in the Game of Thrones series of novels.
Yeah. So obviously J.R.R. Martin's a fantasy writer, but I read a couple of things that he said. Obviously, he came to visit Hadrian's Wall, and that's one of the things that inspired his book. And he took this sort of similar view to me. He just couldn't understand how they could think the Hadrian's Wall was just a customs post, because it was absolutely massive. So he was quite disparaging of those views as well. But that's novelists. We can write and think what we like, whereas your historians have to be a bit more guarded, a bit more careful, and back things up with strong evidence before they write anything down.
I think anyone who's seen a Glasgow Rangers Glasgow Celtic match would see why the wall was built.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was my home team is Queen of the South, so they're a lot less fearsome.
Oh, well, that's the brilliant Billy Connolly joke, isn't it? He always thought that Queen of the South was called Queen of the South nil.
Yeah, I remember that one too. Yeah, which is why I played rugby rather than football.
Ah, good stuff. Well, this has been fantastic, Alistair. Thank you very much. Put links in the show notes for listeners if they want to delve more into Alistair's stories, the first two of which are set around the Hadrian's Wall and those violent tribes that the poor old auxiliaries have to deal with.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Ollie.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to listen to Saturday's pod with Miranda Malins and Sarah Gristwood as we describe herstory. See what we did there. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.